with the policy program at the Africa Center, and I'll be moderating today's program. We'll be starting shortly, but first, a few words about the Africa Center for those joining us for the first time. We are a multidisciplinary institution. We're engaged in the fields of arts, policy, and business, and focus primarily on narrative shifting surrounding the continent of Africa. For us, we believe it's important what information gets to shape the world's understanding of a place and its people, but also who gets to communicate this information. As a result, we work to center perspectives from and of the continent in conversations that pertain to them. As part of that work, we put on public programs every month, such as this one today, which is on the cost of living crisis in Africa. According to the IMF, food and energy costs account for the bulk of rising inflation in sub-Saharan Africa, due in part to disruptions to supply chains caused by the outbreak of war in Ukraine. These issues, exacerbated by the lingering effects of COVID-19 and climate factors, have contributed to increased rates of financial and social vulnerability. We have regional and subject matter experts who will help us understand the causes, effects, and how we can fix it. Mayeni Jones is a multimedia journalist based in Lagos, currently working as the BBC's West Africa correspondent. Mr. Uzochukwu Alutu is a passionate international development professional and practitioner with 10 years of experience obtained from a diverse range of institutions. And Immaculata Abba is a Nigerian writer and artist whose work explores the history and manifestation of ideas that inform how Africans make a living, find belonging, and create meaning in our lives. All right, so I'm going to go to you, Uzo, with this first question. This discussion will deal with the sharp increase in, and put simply, how much it costs for the average individual to fund their lives. Cost of living encompasses a number of societal factors, and so it is a little difficult to define. Could you briefly summarize what sorts of expenses we're referring to when we talk about cost of living in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much, Temi. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll try to break it down. Basically, I know very well that a lot of us, including you, Temi, may have at some point in your life had to make a choice between perhaps going to school in Geneva or going to school in the UK. And then, you're probably are faced with the same quality of education for both schools in terms of the curricular, but then you're looking at other factors like, oh, what about the cost of housing? What about the cost of transportation, the school fee or the tuition fee, as well as other costs. So in doing that exercise, sort of like a back of an envelope calculation, you're literally, coming, out or a process that actually gives you the cost of living for those countries or for those geographical areas that you're looking at, or cities. And when you come up with a total, then you're able to compare both and say, okay, yeah, this Geneva seems to be have a higher cost of living than the UK. So we do that most times. We also do that when we get a new job, and then you're comparing where you're currently living with, where you're expected to go to make a choice. So in that sense, I'm just trying to say that this is not something new. It's something we all have done at some point in our lives. So basically, if I'm to define it, I'll just say, look, it's basically the sum of the total amount or the cost of living in a particular geographical area, and it's the average as well, taken for various number of individuals or households that are in that location, and then you come up with a figure that describes the cost of living. What is particularly interesting is that there are two types. So you have the out-of-pocket, which is the one that you spend, but there's also the one that you give to the state or through taxes, which is also included in what constitutes the cost of living. Again, we could think about the shocks that affect the cost of living. I think that's also part of the issues that will be coming up in this conversation. First are shocks like climate effects or changes in the environment that could impact transportation costs. all their related costs. You also have the pandemic, like the COVID that we just experienced, as well as internal or global crisis, like the Russia-Ukraine crisis or war that the world is confronted with. So I'll leave it here for now.
Yeah, and Uzo, I'm actually going to stick with you for my next question, which you touched on a bit. But the COVID-19 pandemic is officially over across the world. Some countries are recovering more easily than others. How, if at all, did COVID contribute to the increases in cost of living in Africa?
Yeah, so I can think of three main channels. There are a number of channels, but I think broadly speaking, three main channels. And the first really has to do with the supply disruptions. We know what COVID did. There was restrictions in human movements and goods and services. So certainly that had an effect on supply. And so for sectors like healthcare, where there was increased demand, and of course, when you have higher demand than supply, you have a shortage. And in that sense, the cost of those products will increase. So that increases cost of living in that regard. The other factor has to do with the massive decline in capital imports. So for those of us not very familiar with our term, we're literally talking about foreign portfolio investments or foreign direct investments, and also diaspora remittances. So basically, we're looking at what comes in from outside of the country, especially for African countries that really depend on a lot of foreign investments and as well as remittances. So all that sort of declined during the COVID period massively, and that affected external reserves of most of these countries. So, and when your external reserves are affected, that has a lot of impact on your ability to stabilize your currency. I'm trying to break it down. So, and when you have your currency is no longer stable, what then happens is that you have to devalue your currency, or you go into a currency depreciation. And if you're an import-dependent country, what it means is that your imports become more expensive, and that also means that the goods and services that your citizens consume become more expensive, and that also impacts inflation and generally the cost of living. The last one has to do with the loss of export income. Here, basically, we're saying that when you restrict movements in people and goods and services, your manufacturing sectors get the greatest hits, and you cannot actually export goods outward. And also that sort of compromises your macroeconomic position and the ability of governments to effectively manage inflation. So these are, for me, the three broad areas through which COVID had affected countries and their cost of living.
Yeah, thank you for that. And comparatively, Africa saw relatively low rates of infection and mortality from COVID. So why is economic recovery still more sluggish?
Interesting question. If I wanted to go easy on this one, I would have said, globalization is particularly the cause here. But beyond that is the fact that, there are certain structural factors that were already pre-existing before COVID and that were very peculiar to African countries. First is that poverty rates in Africa were already elevated. And because of their lack of fiscal space at the time, countries had to, go to get funds through debt financing. And so what then happened was that they had, a massive debt accumulation. And when that happens, that obviously affects the ability of government to provide services to its citizens, because you literally have no space to be able to make an impact with respect to your budget. It will interest you to know that between 2010 and 2022, debt levels to GDP in Africa increased by as much as 183%. And that got us to a high of about 1.8 trillion US dollars, Africa as a whole. And between 2019 and the start of the COVID in 2020, countries that had reached the threshold of 60% by the IMF with respect to debt, sustainability had moved from 18 to 27. So that also shows you how much of that kind of plays out in terms of how Africa, took the heat of the social and economic factors, despite not having so much of impact with respect to the health crisis in itself. The other one factor that plays out really strongly here has to do with import dependence. So a lot of African countries are import dependent. And just like I said earlier, when you're import dependent, when there are shocks, external shocks, that affects directly your ability to withstand imported inflation, especially when you do not have much of a productive economy to be able to get products out there. So that in the post-COVID era, that obviously affected a lot of African countries and the ability to build back stronger. And of course, tied to building back stronger was that countries faced with these challenges, especially mounting debt crisis, had to go for fiscal responses, such as fiscal consolidation. By that, I mean like tightening up their belts, increasing taxes. And of course, if you increase taxes, that's obviously increasing the cost of living. And then going for unconventional monetary policies, such as helicopter money distributions as ways to provide palliative measures to cushion the effects of COVID. And that in itself is really expensive and had an impact on cost of living generally. So I'll leave it there for now.
Of course. And once again, you kind of answered a bit of my next question in your previous answer. So you can just say whatever you want on this last topic. But the servicing of public debt has accounted for an increasingly large part of government expenditure in African countries. So to what extent are these burdens contributing to cost of living increases for citizens?
Interesting. I'll say to a very large extent. But again, I also want to put a caveat there, and that's the fact that this relationship is actually bi-directional. So we would expect that higher cost of living would also increase government debt burdens. So in the sense that if the cost of products in an economy are more expensive, then it also means that government's ability to render services and goods that citizens require, would impact more on their budgets. And if there's a tighter fiscal space, then they have to borrow. So in that sense, but to answer your question, yes, it affects it to a larger extent, because when you have higher debt service burden, for instance, a country like Nigeria that has, as I said last year, the IMF said Nigeria to be having a debt service of 96% of its total revenues. So that already tells you that you're left with just 4% of your revenues. And when you have a shortfall in revenues to that extent, you would deprioritize capital spending and do more for recurrent expenditure, because you have to pay salaries, you have contractual arrears, for roads that have been built that have to be paid. If not, there's going to be pandemonium in the economic system. So what then gets left off is the capital spend and the actual goods and services that could make our lives better. Now, I want to make it more illustrative, and I give you an example. If there is a power grid installation that becomes faulty, for instance, and then a government like that of Nigeria that already has 96% debt service to revenue ratio, cannot then deploy immediately to provide or to fix that installation and get those services functional right on time. Now, how does it impact the overall economy? It could do that in two ways. So first is that the firms that rely on this grid will have to source for alternative sources of electricity, mostly fossil fuel power generators. And you have to consider the cost of getting those generators, as well as the fueling of them and running them. So it could do two things. It's either the firm increases the unit price of its products, because the a new input cost has emerged, which was not foreseen because of that shock. That then passes through to the consumers and affects cost of living. The other one is the firm could decide to keep the price constant, but then moderates the production capacity. Now, what that does is that it could actually either affect employment, the employment level in the economy, because if you're not producing as much as you did yesterday, today, what you might then do is to reduce the staffing or the amount of people you employ to do the production. And then once you do that, that obviously affects the general economy and the poverty levels. And the other bit is when you have lower production and the same amount of demand, you have scarcity. And that obviously could amount to black markets emerging. And when you have black markets emerging, that also affects the prices because they will have to put a markup on the usual price to be able to get it because of the scarcity. So that also goes into the prices of goods and services in the economy. So you could think of it to as many as other public goods and services like roads and other forms of infrastructure or even provision of healthcare and so on. So yeah, but yeah, that's a bit of my answer to that question.
Lovely, thank you. And Mayeni, I'm going to shift over to you now for the last contributing factor that we want to discuss before moving on to our next section. So, African countries have no direct stake in the conflict in Ukraine, yet developments there have also played a role in cost of living in Africa, food and energy costs primarily. Why?
Well, both Ukraine and Russia are some of the world's biggest producers of grain. Russia produces a lot of fertilizer that's used in agriculture across the African continent. And in terms of food prices, Ukraine was one of the kind of main suppliers to the World Food Program, which is very active in Africa. About 80% of the grain that the World Food Program was using was being supplied by Ukraine. So what happened is when the war started and Russia captured some areas of Ukraine that had some of its kind of biggest ports, Turkey, which is positioned itself as a kind of a neutral party in this conflict, along with the UN, helped the countries negotiate a deal whereby grain from Ukraine would still be allowed to go through territorial waters that were now being occupied by Russia. Recently, Russia has now said that it would no longer abide by this deal because it feels like it's not getting its end of the bargain. It's kind of nothing's in it for it. It wants sanctions to be lifted on it. At the moment, it's making things very difficult for Russia. The sanctions have been imposed by the international community because of its illegal occupation of Ukraine. And so that deal that was allowing grain to leave Ukraine and come to Africa via the World Food Program can no longer come, or if it is coming, it's coming through a much longer route. And as Uzo was saying in his introduction, a lot of African countries rely on imports, rely on food aid, rely on external factors for their food, particularly when it comes to things like grain that are tricky to grow on the continent. So those are some of the reasons why that conflict, which feels so far away for a lot of Africans, has had an impact on the cost of living on the continent.
And I'll stick with you for this next question. In the case of sudden changes to economic conditions, I imagine that the pain isn't always felt evenly across society, as some segments of the workforce are more equipped to withstand shocks than others. You've written recently about the effects on young professionals, specifically in highly skilled fields. What did you find?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I'm not Nigerian myself, I'm from Sierra Leone, but I've lived in Nigeria for 5 years. I moved here in 2018 and I've really kind of, noticed a shift. I think when I came in 2018, it was maybe the tail end of kind of a lot of optimism about Nigeria's economic performance. I met a lot of young Nigerians who had studied abroad and lived abroad and then decided to come home to Nigeria, either for the first time or come back if they'd studied here before. But really, we've seen a shift over the last 5 years where, the economy's really suffered very badly. And then if you add to that the economic shocks of COVID and the war in Russia and Ukraine, it's had a negative impact on the Nigerian economy. And that's led to a reverse of that trend of young people coming to Nigeria. We're now seeing a lot of young people choosing to go abroad, either to skill up, go to university, or to look for other jobs. So, for example, it's really hard to get reliable statistics about how many people are leaving Nigeria every week. But we certainly know that in the UK, before the pandemic in 2019, a certain number of student visas were granted to Nigerians, and that number has gone up 700%. So 700% more Nigerians are getting student visas in the UK at the moment. And they're often in very skilled areas: engineering, medicine, nursing. There's a shortage of care workers in the UK, and a lot of Nigerians have the skills that are needed. And because the UK's left the European Union, and so it's not as easy anymore for European citizens to work there, it's looking outside of the EU for workers, and Nigeria has been one of its kind of main contributors. But then Zimbabwe is another country where it has a much smaller population than Nigeria, but it's a lot of care workers from Zimbabwe have been given visas to come to the UK. So those are some of the ways that the economy, the cost of living crisis is leading people to leave. They can no longer afford the salaries that they're making on the continent. And so they're having to looking for jobs in Europe, in America, elsewhere, so that they can make enough money. And that money ties in also to what Uzo was talking earlier about remittances. It allows them to then send money back home at a time when unemployment is also very high. And that's the way that we're kind of seeing the economy affects the workforce here on the continent.
Yeah. And on the brain drain, is there a reason to think that this trend is temporary or reversible?
I'm a reporter, so I'm sure maybe, some people have done more in-depth research, but anecdotally from my reporting, at the moment, nobody really wants to leave home. People feel like they have to leave home because they're looking for better opportunities elsewhere. I think it would take a real reversal of Nigeria's economic fate to encourage a lot of the people that have left to come back. I think life has become so difficult for people that even the middle classes are finding it difficult to do things like, shop for food, pay their bills. And at the moment, I think people are kind of waiting to see what happens. There's a new administration now in Nigeria. So people are waiting to see what happens here, to see what will change. And in a number of African countries, in Ghana, for example, the economy is doing very poorly. A lot of these shocks are created by the global economy. There's a downturn everywhere. I think it affects Africa particularly more because we do rely a lot on imports, because factors like insecurity, for example, have made it hard for us to grow our own food, which means that, we have to import food from other countries. So I think in order for people to come back, the cost of living would have to come down dramatically. Jobs would have to increase a lot. There are very few African governments at the moment that have the ability, that have the finances, that have the vision to implement economic plans, long-term economic plans that would perhaps lead to some of the growth that would encourage people to come back. So, I try not to be too negative in my reporting of the continent. I'm an African person myself, and I want to be optimistic, but things are not looking very good right now.
Yeah. And what are the consequences in the countries or communities that they leave, even beyond the economic implications?
I mean, take an example of Senegal. A couple of weeks ago, I did a report on Senegal where these young fishermen had tried to take one of the most dangerous migrant journeys. So from the coast of Senegal on these kind of wooden fishing boats, they try and get to Spain. It's incredibly choppy. If anybody's been to Senegal before, it's kind of Atlantic. It faces the Atlantic Ocean. The sea is choppy on a good clear day. So if there's any kind of bad weather, those boats often get capsized, and a lot of the people on them aren't able to kind of swim the lengths that would be needed to get back to shore. And in this case, this boat was found with just, after it being at sea for over a month, with just a fraction of the people that had set off. And most of the people from that boat came from a very small village called Faspoy in Senegal, a fishing village. And I spoke to members of their families. They were completely, devastated at the news that their loved ones had gone. but and it left this huge gap behind. I spoke to the brother of one of the men who passed away, and he said he was leaving a family, 2 young children and a wife behind. But what was interesting about that conversation is when I spoke to that brother, I said to him, have you ever considered doing this journey and going abroad? And he said, yeah, I tried a month before my brother. We both had tried it, and then we failed, and as soon as he got back, he wanted to go straight away. And to be honest, I'm not going to lie to you, even though my brother died, I would still do that journey again tomorrow if a boat presented itself, if an opportunity presented itself. So I think it just goes to show the kind of depth of the desperation of a lot of people who are leaving either by legal means to study or to work, or illegally through boats or by land. There's a real sense of desperation, particularly amongst young Africans, that there simply isn't enough work for the number of them that is there. And they're willing to risk it all, even though they leave, a lot of pain behind, even though, the lack of the shortage of medical staff, for example, in Nigeria, it really has an impact on the kind of healthcare you get here. I often joke with my son, I have a toddler, a little boy who likes to jump on furniture. And if he does it on a Sunday, I'm like, I'm not guaranteed that we'll find a doctor at the hospital, if you hurt yourself. So you need to keep any injuries for the Monday when they're back at work. So it has a real detrimental impact on African societies, shortage of staff, missing loved ones. But I think for a lot of young people, it's a price that at the moment they feel willing to pay.
Yeah. And how does immigrating affect the mental health of those who relocate? Do they deal with loneliness? And how difficult is it for them to adjust socially in their new societies?
Yeah, I think, in the case of that I mentioned earlier of the UK and Nigeria, it's slightly less difficult because a lot of Nigerians have networks in the UK, in the US, and that's primarily why they've been applying for visas there, because they know that they have, people, friends of friends or family that they can kind of rely on to help them settle down. But increasingly, we are seeing people looking to go to places where they haven't got that network. I've heard of young Nigerians applying for visas in Hungary, in Australia, places that are a bit, off the beaten path, because they feel like it might be easier for them to get visas, or, the universities there don't charge as much if they're looking to upskill. And that can really lead to a lot of isolation, a lot of loneliness, a feeling of displacement. Often you see, when you speak to people who have moved, somewhere where they haven't got many friends and family, and they come back here for holidays, etc., they talk of that disconnect with the communities that they've gone to. But more and more, I think, despite the kind of pain of leaving home, I think the reality of being back home, and more importantly, the difference that their incomes can make to their families back home, I think kind of fuels people and kind of propels them on their journey. But it's certainly not an easy process. And I think a lot more work needs to be done to highlight some of the challenges that face people when they move abroad. So, even you mentioned mental health, but it can also be tied to how difficult it is to find housing, how difficult it is to make ends meet. A city like London is incredibly expensive to live in. And I think a lot of people who move there to work are shocked at how difficult it is for them to make enough money to send home. So certainly, yeah, lots of challenges for people who decide to relocate.
Thank you, Mayeni. Immaculata, I'm going to come to you now. And Mayeni, I'll be back to you later. Immaculata, several studies have shown that in periods of economic downturn, the effects on women have been more pronounced. How has this translated in the current cost of living crisis? How have women specifically seen the effects of these problems manifest differently or more intensely in their lives?
Well, first of all, like a lot of what Mayeni and Uzochukwu have said, just like have triggered this sense of like facing the problem that we are all living through. Like this conversation about Japan and people living is very current in my life. And though what I'm about to say is not about this current cost of living crisis, but Mayeni's comments reminded me of a photography project I saw some time ago on communities in Africa, where most of the men had left for greener pastures, essentially leaving families run by more or less single mothers. I can't, if I remember it, I'll send it to the Africa Center to share. But your question in particular made me think of the quote by Frank O'Hara that goes, "In times of crisis, we must all decide again and again whom we love." And that's the thing about crisis like this, like they show us our loyalties, our beliefs, and like the structures that carry society. And one thing about African societies right now in this point in time is that women are very much still second-class citizens. So persistent pay inequality cuts even deeper now. More women are being pushed out of employment, again, because of cutting of jobs, because there are no, like production has to go down, as Uzochukwu described. But even more and more, women's work is undervalued and not paid. I mean, there's a lot of labor that women do that is just not paid. And now it seems like there's more justification for that, because anyway, there's no money in the economy. Barriers to financial access, even further even lower. And then there's the whole conversation around time poverty and around women's time and women's work. In an economy where it's very much like, survival and all hands on deck in whatever ways you can, we see that women have to take on more family work, more care work in and outside the office. That is, I mean, there's this stat from the ILO in 2019 on how women spend 3.7 times more on unpaid care and domestic work than men, leaving them with even less time to engage in paid work and entrepreneurship. And these are the kind of things that really trap women into disempowering systems, and options such as like marriage as a means of livelihood and increased exposure to abuse at home because of your financial, your lack of financial independence, but also in workplaces when eventually it's a kind of worms that we can go into, but to keep it within this, more essentially existing inequalities are just exacerbated.
And I'm going to stick with you to go into this conversation more about administering the state. So in a situation where it costs more for a government to meet its responsibility to its people, and as in the case in most African countries, they're operating under severely strained budgets, it seems inevitable that some things will have to become less prioritized. Do you have a sense of what is currently being neglected?
The things that are currently being neglected are not, the neglect didn't start today. It didn't start with this cost of living crisis. I mean, over time, we can always see like waves here and there. But I can speak to perhaps the 80s. First of all, actually, it feels a lot like I'm living in what I read about the 80s, the waves of immigration, the economy, the like sharp sense of doom and anyway, so a lot of what I'm going to describe is stuff that I think and I see has been neglected for decades now. And it's that, by and large, it's like we're being lured to believe that we need to prioritize short-term goals over building capacity for long-term outcomes. And personally, I think it's most critical in sectors of education, research and experimentation, maintenance, the culture and the arts, and institutional support for things we colloquially regard as non-essential to survival, such as welfare and like human rights. Those things, in this time of crisis, it's like, well, we can, we don't need to, these are problems for the future, problems for when we have the capacity. But the thing is, information, research, and maintenance, especially to me, are the essential elements of development. Like you need to be constantly investing in understanding your problems as much, maybe even more than in executing the solutions. And I don't think I know for a fact that it's been neglected very severely. Anyone who goes to any federal university in Nigeria can tell you for free, can show you for free just by looking at them, really.
And my next question, the continent has made large gains across a range of socio-developmental measures over the last decade, for example, life expectancy, Given the current situation, on what issues can African countries least afford to see slowed progress on?
The answer I would most prefer to give is that definitely everything. Like we can't choose any solution, any problem as being more pressing than the other. a lot of people argue with me on this, but I don't think so. But if I were to choose, there are two things. And one is definitely the development of human capacity, which is tied to employment and labor, which is then also tied to internal revenue and production on the inside. But to really keep this first point to like human capacity development, 60% of Africa is under 25. And according to the African Development Bank, 1/3 of this Africa's youth population is unemployed and discouraged. And that 1/3 vulnerably employed. I don't know what they mean by vulnerable. I don't know if I would count. I probably would count as vulnerably employed as a freelancer myself. And that's saying a lot because I would think that I am managing, but that's 2/3. And then 1/6 is in straight up wage unemployment. And for me, this statistic shows an intense amount of potential for both peaceful development, but also a lot of chaos, depending on how it's being addressed. And I don't think we can afford to see any slow progress on this at all. We're looking at wars, we're looking at crisis, we're looking at hunger and starvation really as well. And relating to that, but I make this a second separate point, but I think okay, this point is a bit difficult to say because I generally assume that people in positions of authority to make these calls are not stupid, they're not ill-educated or short-sighted. At least this is my general assumption. But then I also know that sometimes desperation, economic desperation, such as this kind of cost of living crisis, can make a lot of these decision-making people, bodies, cower into unfavorable international trade deals that diminish our economic sovereignty. And I know also that our current import dependence is a manifestation of fault lines from colonial economies, how the colonial economies were designed. But we definitely have a lot of responsibility to take in like biting the bullet and making really tough choices to improve production and manufacturing capacity. I've had the opportunity to work in a small manufacturing company in Enugu. And the stress is intense. The company manufactures plastic pipes and we import the things like, so I know Nigeria produces oil, we export that, but even the PVC material that you need from oil to make pipes, we import that as well. And it reminds me of Iwale Lawal tweet that I haven't forgotten, where he says, I heard your country exports millions of crude blacks and imports fewer millions of refined Nigerians at double the price. For me, that like, I mean, there's also, he's making a comment on Nigerians in general, but thinking of it in terms of Nigeria's natural resources, there's just so much more we can do in developing our capacity, in processing the natural resources that we have before putting them out for export. Take green hydrogen, for example. Green hydrogen is this new, shiny newcomer in the energy transitions conversations currently happening around the world. And a lot of these deals and conversations are between Europe and African countries or between Europe and Latin American countries. And for me, they're following the same exploitative, extractivist patterns and logics that we saw with oil, with cobalt and coal. So with green hydrogen, for example, what I think African countries would be better off doing is in using their low-cost hydrogen potential to develop competitive industries like steel, because steel apparently is going to be super competitive with coal-based manufacturing production very, very soon. So that would, for me, would be a more beneficial investment than exporting the resources in crude from only for us to have to buy it back years down the line for much, much higher prices. But having said that, of course, this kind of long-term thinking will come with serious sacrifices. And those sacrifices, I believe, have to come with plans and policies to show concern to soothe the stress that those sacrifices will come with. One more thing I want to add is actually that to go back to the colonial economics legacy, the legacies of colonial economics, I think there's space on this table. There's a seat on this table for advocacy for debt forgiveness and some kind of colonial reparations for African countries, but that's for another day.
Thank you for that, Immaculata. So we're going to move into our last section of discussion questions. So I'll come back to you at the very end. But Uzo, I'm finally going to come back to you. It seems notable than most, if not all, the contributing factors to Africa's current cost of living crisis are occurring elsewhere. Granted, in a globalized world, this is to be expected to an extent, but would we be incorrect in concluding that African actors, so governments, regional bodies, industries, appear somewhat powerless to meaningfully affect the situation?
Not at all. In fact, I think, and piggybacking on what Immaculata and Mayeni have said so far regarding Africa's human resource, I actually think that there is potentially, like African countries are potentially capable of meaningfully affecting the situation, especially because of the abundance of human and natural resources that reside in the continent. And what perhaps might be the problem, I would imagine, would be the inability of these countries to adequately harness or derive the full dividends of the demographic gifts that Africa has. And the rest of the world is very well aware of this conundrum, and I think they are also exploiting Africa in this regard. But I think that there will always be, and there has always been, an increasing attractiveness for the continent Africa, not least with the current Russia-Ukraine crisis. And it then behooves on African countries to make out what they want to do with such attractiveness in terms of strategically, utilizing such attraction to the advantage. And basically, this was what I was hinging upon in my recent article regarding Africa's perspectives with respect to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where I was essentially saying that Africa has to craft its own worldview, with respect to how it intends to interact with the rest of the world, in terms of enhancing trade and economic, interactions, and of course, diplomacy or dealings, in that sense. And I think the time is ripe. There is no better time. I mean, this is not news. Everyone has been saying the same thing, but I think that there's no better time than now to begin to really come together, to refocus our agenda in Africa. And for me, I think it really begins with effective leadership around the continent. I'll leave it at that. And I'm saying that because when we talk about regional bodies, for instance, the AU is literally just a composition of the various leaders in this country, in these countries, in Africa. So basically, if you don't have effective leadership, when they come together, the outcomes are definitely going to be suboptimal. So that's exactly what I'm saying.
Thank you. And Mayeni, are there risks to the continent having such globalized food and energy systems? For example, how disruptions in food supply chains due to the conflict of Ukraine affected Africa, and what are some alternatives?
Yes, it's definitely risky. I think the example of the conflict in Ukraine driving food prices right across the world has exposed that. And also during COVID, we saw that, supply chains being frozen in China and elsewhere then led to difficulties. I'm not sure that we can put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to globalization and the fact that we've exported a lot of our supply chains and we've exported a lot of where we get our food from. I think in an ideal world, a lot of African countries would like to be able to produce the majority of their food. The way that Europe and America and other developed nations have been able to do that is by subsidizing their farming heavily. So that could be an avenue. But I think the challenge in a lot of African countries when it comes to subsidizing agriculture and creating some sort of agricultural industry that is able to feed its population is it takes a lot of money. You have to plan for the future. You have to plan beyond your kind of 4-8 year political term. And that's something that traditionally has been challenging for a lot of leaders on the continent. And you also have to, invest in other things. So in a country like Nigeria, where I am at the moment, investing in agriculture alone won't be sufficient. A lot of the countryside is deeply insecure, unsafe. Kidnapping gangs roam large swathes of the country. They're being influenced as well by terrorist groups like the so-called Islamic State, which is infiltrating kidnapping gangs in parts of the country where they weren't before, like the northwest, like the center of the country. And so that's led to big levels of migration of rural communities into major cities. I visited Niger State in the center of the country, I think it was just before the pandemic in 2019. And back then, one of the market leaders was saying to me, look at all these people here in the capital. These are people who used to be in the countryside just a year ago. So a year from now, all of the rice and anything that they were growing, that's not going to be in the market. And that means prices are going to arise. And this was even before the pandemic. So after the pandemic, you have, not only domestically, Nigeria isn't producing a lot of its own food, but it's also struggled to import food due to factors that we've mentioned before. So there are real structural challenges that countries like Nigeria have to kind of deal with. They have to deal with the insecurity. They have to deal with power generation. At the moment, lots of farmers are finding it expensive to get their produce into the market, into the cities in the first place, because fuel has gone up. There used to be a fuel subsidy, which was a way that Nigerians could get some sort of benefit from the country's large oil revenue. That's now been removed. That's made fuel a lot more expensive, so people can't bring their food to market. So there are all these kind of other factors that need to be put in place before we're able to do things like produce our own food.
Thank you, Mayeni. And now for the final question of the panel. This is actually for all the panelists. So I'll begin with Uzo and then go to Mayeni and Immaculata, just in the order we started in. But the question is, as we've discussed, it's unlikely that there is one single fix to address Africa's cost of living crisis. But based on your personal understandings of the relevant issues and perspectives on what policy priorities should be, what kind of government interventions would be most worthwhile today? How, if at all, does the average person feel as though they can affect policy? So that was a lot, Uzo, but just any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, thank you. The first thing that comes up in my head will be a bottom-up action type approach to the challenge of solving cost of living crisis on the continent. So by that I mean, as an economist, you probably expect me to go with structural issues, but I go from the roots, right? It's about even if you have the best of capacity in terms of like economists, and then you don't have the governance system working optimally in terms of governance reforms, then we're just tinkering on the margins. So in that sense, it will be that local governance is emphasized. I give you an example. In Nigeria today, local governments, the whole idea of local government autonomy has been a big issue for many years since democracy. But then no one is really bringing that to the to the fore in terms of like policy agenda issues that need to be discussed. If you want to solve cost of living crisis, it must start from the community. Because that is where I purchase my stuff. I go get my groceries from the store nearby. The road that I use to go to work is just right across my street. So why then are we focusing more on like more macro problems when we should actually be focusing on like the local government systems, trying to get it to function? Because if it works from the bottom up, then I'm sure we will all be better off, because everyone exists or resides in a particular geography. So if we start looking at things from that very micro level, I think it's really going to be very important. And of course, there are a lot of avenues at the local level for engagement, political dialogue. Even young people should be more involved at the local levels in terms of politics and voting and being voted for. And that drives me to my last point, which is really about the process through which leaders emerge. I think that is really critical. I wrote an article that was published at the LSC Africa blog earlier this year. And basically what I was saying was that Nigeria is running low on taxes and trust. But again, to be able to pay taxes, citizens have to trust that you would reciprocate, right? So, but the point is, how would they pay those taxes if government has not proven to be functional? So it still boils down to the whole mechanism of governance and how citizens get the goods and services that they require. So, and I think that the process through which a leader emerges is very critical, and that could help us solve a bunch of issues. And as young people who want to see a brighter future, different from the one that we have today, or we see in the continent today, which is more or less characterized by happy coup. I call them happy coups because a military invasion, it takes place and then people are jubilating on the streets. How do you describe that? So it just tells you that even the so-called democracy in some of these economies is awash, it's not working, and something has to be done about it. So we need to raise our voices. We need to go into campaigns, advocate for better governance at the local levels, and one day it will all come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Uzo. Mayeni, your take on that question?
So I can, I'm most familiar with West Africa, so I think I'll focus here. One of the biggest challenges we have in the region is, electricity and power generation. I think if that was if steady electricity was something that the majority of people in West Africa could come by, that would certainly help people achieve a lot more, earn a lot more. It would help with things like food production. It would help with manufacturing. So I think if there was kind of one thing a lot of governments in the region could kind of tackle is power generation. I grew up in the Ivory Coast in the 90s and the early 2000s when the economy there was thriving, and they had very solid power generation. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of businesses flocked to Abidjan and why the economy was able to boom so much was partly because it was seen as somewhere where infrastructure worked, where there was power, where you didn't need to pay for extra things like generators and solar power and panels that would take away from your bottom line. And so I think that that's a way that the cost of living crisis could be tackled. Another way as well would be for African countries to remove some of the trade barriers between them. Okay, so we're not able to grow everything that we need to eat, so we're not able to manufacture everything that we need, but rather than have to, import refined fuel from Europe, and the quality of it might be subpar, and it will cost you a lot of money to bring in, why not find a way of collaborating with your neighbors next door that might have that capacity that you need, or might have those goods that you need. I think intra-Africa trade is already counts for a lot, but I think there's still a lot of barriers for African countries to be able to trade amongst themselves, custom barriers, taxes, etc. Perhaps removing some of those might help. And then in terms of how individuals can influence policy, it's an incredibly tricky thing to do, right? On the continent, because we are seeing a real crisis of democracy. I think in developed nations, one way that citizens can hold their governments accountable is at the ballot box. You're not doing good things in the UK. A lot of people are not happy with the Conservatives, and we've seen at local elections, they've lost a lot of seats. That is slightly trickier to do in Africa because, as Uzo mentioned in his answer, we're seeing the growth of these coups d'etat. So there are no real democratic institutions in a growing number of countries. And then in others, there have been, repeated complaints of flawed elections. And so the voices of the people aren't always being heard. And that makes it very difficult for people to know how they can influence policy, on a macro level. I think that a lot of people are just doing what they can to kind of create their own governments in their homes. They're providing their own water, they're providing their own electricity. And perhaps the way that you kind of make this less about yourself is, okay, externalize some of that to your wider community, to your neighborhood, to your village, to your, some of the kind of measures that you're taking to provide for your home. Perhaps, use some of those resources to help the wider community around you. Because I think if we're not able to reach our leaders to send that message through the ballot box to say we're not happy with this, how can we change our lives and the lives of those around us? Well, I think it's just by kind of doing what we can for our immediate community.
Thank you, Mayeni. And Immaculata, we'll end on you with this question, and then we'll move on to audience questions.
Thank you. Infrastructure is such a big one. Infrastructure is so big. It's so personal to me as well. What Mayeni said about power, my experience working in that manufacturing company, anybody who is making anything in Nigeria, like calling it a Sisyphean battle is an understatement. Power is so, it feels so much like air, in fact, that I almost like you forget to talk about it. You forget that, like right now there's no lights when I'm speaking to you. I hope my battery doesn't die. I hope my Wi-Fi doesn't die so I can keep talking to you. But infrastructure, I would echo that. And then to the question of how does the average person feel as though they can affect policy? From what I can see, the people around me physically, the people in the social media that I consume, people are helpless. Well, people are hopeless, not helpless. The helplessness is perceived, but there's a weight of hopelessness that I haven't felt since I was back in boarding school. I just haven't seen this or heard like. And when you're in boarding school, it's easy to be like, okay, well, we're hopeless inside here because this is just a microcosm, and outside there's the real life. Life still happens there. But my parents, people that I have never, heard be like, oh, this is actually bad. Things are bad. People are feeling hopeless. But I think the helplessness is not real. I think the helplessness is actually like, it's one of those things that you could either think you're helpless or you think you're not helpless. And I think on a very individual and like small community, hyper-local levels of society, there is so much, yes, that is outside of your control, but there's so much that is within your control. And we really have to believe that everything that is within our control affects every single other thing. Doing not just charity, but doing the right thing. Like if you have a position in your office, just do what you're meant to do, report what you're meant to report. Obviously, easier said than done. But those things, they add up, they build the bigger system that we can see. But also those things are also about other things. Like you can't say you're working in AEDC and it's not going to affect water board. You can't say you're working in water board and what you're doing is not going to affect, the Ministry of Health. All of this is pretty much interconnected. I do definitely think that in terms of impact by number, more impact is made in the top down. Like only a few people declare war, only a few people declare certain policies, only a few people remove subsidy now as opposed to maybe 20 years ago, as opposed to not at all. But yes, the makings of good leadership, like Uzochukwu said, the makings of the thing, the understanding, it comes from below, it comes from 20 years ago. Right now, I think we're suffering the consequences of things that were set in motion in the 80s, in the 60s, in the 40s even. And that like long-term thinking for me is really a way that every single individual person can effect change, can be part of policy. Prioritizing in your mind, in your heart, in whatever you do, the understanding of the problem before you fix the problem or before you attempt the problem, I think is something that as Nigerians, we are forced to not practice. We're forced to really like, oh no, just do, obey before complaining is an example. Like, just do now, there's no time, there's no money, we don't have the resources, then what you're doing extra, da, 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 da. But it really is necessary. That's for me.
Thank you, Immaculata. And now we'll move into audience questions. So this first question is going to be for you, Uzo. Globalization kind of means that no one country gets to be completely self-determinate. We're all, for better or worse, dependent on each other. Considering this, does Africa want more economic autonomy work contrary to this?
We broke off at the tail end. Could you just repeat the question?
Of course. Globalization kind of means that no one country gets to be completely self-determinate. We're all, for better or worse, dependent on each other. Considering this, does Africa want more economic autonomy?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's a question that goes in every debate out there, because the argument has always been that, oh, by the way, other countries in the West kind of closed up their borders at some point to focus internally and to grow their manufacturing. Why then is Africa being told to sort of open up itself? And we're seeing sort of the impact of that, because it sort of encourages a bit of dumping in some sense. So yeah, I agree. But globalization has its benefits, no doubt. There is no right or wrong answer to this question, actually, and it depends on how you look at it. So what I will always advise countries to do when it comes to this, globalization is good, but it must make sense for you. And how you come about that is that you must go with an evidence, driven approach to coming up with the policy that you think it's important when it comes to trade, or when it comes to other aspects that have to do with your engagements with the outside world. Internally, I mean, within Africa, there's also regional trading or engagements going on, and the idea is to open up as much as possible. But even with respect to that, some African countries are also feeling that they could get hurt, or their local manufacturing sectors could be affected negatively by just opening up themselves. But the advice really is to say, look, it goes back to where you have your comparative advantage. You must work out your best foot forward. And of course, when you do that, it's a competitive environment. Try not to, own your local production. The worst thing that could ever happen is that you're producing locally, and then even your government doesn't, subscribe to what you're producing. I mean, I think it has to start from home. But as much as possible, engage externally, because there are a lot of benefits. There are a lot of benefits from trade, but do that with evidence. I can't give you like a hardcore answer. It has to do per country. It's different. And of course, it will depend on the evidence on the ground. What the country is facing, the macroeconomic challenges that are peculiar to that country, and why there is need for opening up or not. And sometimes you could decide to close up for a period to get something sorted. But the major thing really is about the seriousness of governments to actually deliver on their promises. So that would depend on how long, or how far you get these things done. But yeah, that's a very valid question. Thank you.
Immaculata, this next one will be for you. Given the limitations and structural challenges that government and state actors face from a policy perspective in addressing the cost of living crisis, is there a role for the private sector in alleviating some of these problems? Curious to hear, this is from an audience member. They said, curious to hear our panelists' thoughts on the potential of public/private partnerships in solving these issues.
Thanks for that question, Mojo. I think there's definitely a role. The role is, we can't do without it. We really can't. We can't afford to. Our government systems are very, very weak for most African countries, if not all. But why it's not an enthusiastic yes is because I'm wary about a lot of public-private partnerships because of the terms and conditions that a lot of the private sector brings with it. That, to me, only exacerbates economic inequality in society. So yes, but we have to be cautious. Yes, but we have to be cautious that we are not selling public goods and services to private hands who are honestly only primarily concerned with profits. This is a reality. It's not saying they're bad people or good people. Like most private companies that enter public-private partnerships, they're there for the profits. They're there for the money they can squeeze out of things. And running a government, running public infrastructure, you can't charge people for air, right? I mean, somebody might one day, but if you're charging people for air, people are going to die very, very soon. So that's just my yes, but.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I agree with Immaculata that there are challenges with public-private partnerships, especially in the African context, because we do lack some of those checks and balances. We had an example during the pandemic where a group of private companies got together. There is no kind of welfare system to speak of here in Nigeria. So a lot of people, when everything shut down during the pandemic, found themselves with no way of making a daily living. And so these private companies bought a bunch of food and some dried goods to kind of distribute to some of the poorest members of society. And then there was outrage when sometime later some of those donations were found to have been stashed by politicians in warehouses, and they hadn't actually been given out. So I think if we do enter into those private-public partnerships, I think perhaps unfortunately the onus would have to be on the private partners to find a way of making sure that the services that they're providing are not somehow being diverted to a purpose other than that. I think maybe to give context for people who don't understand the Nigerian context, the reason people felt that food was being kept is because during elections, politicians go and distribute food, often in poor neighborhoods, etc., to try and get votes. And so people felt that those donations had perhaps been stashed for that purpose. And so I think a lot of kind of transparency work would have to be done by some sort of neutral third party to make sure that those partnerships actually benefit the people they're meant to benefit.
Yeah. I wanted to add a point, but I don't know if
yeah,
okay,
Uzo, go on. I was about to
yeah, I mean, just to literally to add to what Mayeni said, and of course Immaculata added to say, but to say from the perspective of this sustainable development goals, you can see their objectives there are like really humongous. It's not something the public sector can do alone. We need the private sector. Certainly the private sector is very important because a lot of the financing that we require for sustainable development come from the private sector. Now there are a lot of financing approaches like blending to see how we could get both debt financing from the private sector and of course some form of grants also from governments or to get things working. To be encouraged, I would say very strongly. But I think what is critical here is the idea of trust from both ends. The private sector requires some form of signaling in the market system, because if I'm a private investor, I want to be sure that my money is going to yield, results. So in terms of signaling, if it's a green infrastructure, for instance, you want to have been sure that you have passed the criteria so that the providers of those services are credible, and the investor who is bringing in his money will be sure that yes, based off on some metrics that is agreeable to everybody, this makes sense. And if I'm putting my money here, I'm going to get it back. So in some cases, government have to even play the roles of, providing some form of leverage so that private sector can be more confident to invest. So I just wanted to bring in the financing angle to this conversation.
No, thank you for adding in that dimension. And for the final two questions, we can just answer it in a similar style. So starting with Immaculata, then Mayeni, then Uzo. What are local level interventions that could help with the cost of living crisis? And how do we specifically target at-risk groups or more vulnerable groups with policy? So for example, youth and women.
Can I think on this?
Yeah, you can. Mayeni, I don't know if you have an answer, or if Uzo does, whoever does can go.
So it's kind of what local, on the local level, what policy?
Yeah, exactly.
I think things like you know, if suddenly it's becoming difficult to import food and it's making it too expensive, what can you do to kind of, you know, I was speaking to a friend from Zimbabwe, and she was saying that the reason why Zimbabweans are able to withhold the economic shocks there is because even in Harare, even in the capital, people will have a little, you know, garden or a little plot of land. Everybody's a farmer, basically, she was saying, where they can kind of farm their own food. And then, so that even if they can't afford to buy something in the supermarket, you can afford to eat whatever, you can trade with your neighbor. So I think perhaps in these times of crisis, we need to start thinking a bit differently. A lot of cities, particularly, you know, here in West Africa, were kind of grew organically without much planning. So there isn't much in the way of green space. But what can we do to empower people to do things like grow their own food, or to do things like you know, be more sustainable in some way? I think the pandemic gave all of us a bit of a wake-up call that the way that we were living wasn't necessarily sustainable. How can we harness some of those lessons about kind of slowing things down, living differently, you know, being less, you know, polluting, kind of moving a little bit slower? How can we harness some of those lessons to perhaps make life easier for people here? I you know, I went to a talk here in Lagos that was organized by a collective of young people, and they were trying to encourage people to do things that we used to do before, to preserve food, you know, pickling things, putting things in jars, having, you don't have a garden space, learning to grow, you know, peppers or tomatoes in like a little, you know, some sort of little plant potter that you'd put on your balcony or outside your window. So I think, you know, those are kind of like small scale local things that people can kind of do to help themselves. And then, you know, we all have to think about living differently, you know, cutting back on certain things, buying less imported stuff, supporting your local businesses, are all kind of things that you can, you know, small things that can be done on a local level, on an individual level, to try and alleviate the crisis.
Thank you for that thoughtful addition, Mayeni.
Was there a second part to the question that I forgot? Was it two things?
I was asking about some more vulnerable groups, so like youth and women.
And how to help more vulnerable groups, yeah. And I guess if you targeted them with that, exactly. So, you know, if the government was like, we're distributing seeds or we're teaching people how to pickle stuff, maybe focus on, you know, on kind of prioritizing, particularly older women in Nigeria tend to struggle a lot. A lot of them are widows. They lost the income from their husband passing away. So perhaps target those groups with any kind of assistance to help them be more self-sustainable.
Exactly. Very well said. Thank you. Uzo, you're about to hop in.
Yeah, I mean, she answered it really, really well. I just wanted to probably add an experience from one of the projects that I managed while I was in the EU. Basically, it was an employment for results kind of project in the Niger Delta. And it came off from the crisis in the Niger Delta and the need to engage youths in productive ventures in terms of like social services that were required. So for instance, a lot of the roads that were damaged, instead of getting Julius Berger or, you know, some of these other companies, you could train these young ebullient youth in the communities, you know, have to put in time, get into work, and then get the roads fixed. You know, it might not be like expert type fixing of roads, might not be the major roads, but like community roads, and then you get them paid. So that gets them involved in a system. It has a multiplier effect on the markets because they are able to consume more and, you know, increase their gross domestic product in that locality. So we could think of such kinds of projects, target them to these vulnerable groups, depending on the situation. So I just wanted to add for a particular example that I've had in my past work. Yeah.
No, that was another fantastic inclusion. And Immaculata, to end on you, if you thought of anything, but no worries if you haven't.
I've actually learned, because what I'm doing is just practicing fortitude, trying to get stronger, managing, but clearly that doesn't get you too far.
Lovely, thank you. So we'll just wrap up there. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and a special thank you to the panelists for their contributions to this discussion. Everyone should follow the Africa Center on Instagram, as well as make sure to follow all of our panelists on their social media platforms. If they like, they can put it in the chat if they want you to. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us. The ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.